way that we've responded to this situation is to create the adaptation game. So the adaptation game, or TAG, transforms community discussions about climate change and emergency preparedness. It immerses players in science-based scenarios and maps of potential climate disasters where they live. And it unlocks agency, builds knowledge, and generates connection through collective imagination and shared storytelling. So despite the knowledge that we have about climate change, we need better ways to get the community active, to get the community having conversations with each other about what's coming, and getting prepared. And in particular, what we're trying to do with TAG is increase players' level of agency, so increase their own knowledge, increase their own ideas, increase their own capacity to think and act on for themselves and in their communities to prepare for the impacts of climate change, rather than waiting for government or local government to come and sort it out for them. And this is our theory of change. Imagination is preparation. So the general population has a great deal of fear about the size and complexity of climate change and what's facing us. And that fear is paralyzing. The process of playing TAG makes those fears explicit and actionable. We give people a map. We ask them to put themselves on the map, and then we show them, if there's a fire in your area, this is what it could look like. If there's a heat wave, this is what it could look like. If there's a flood, this is what it could look like. And so people can really see the impact for themselves and where they live. Throughout the process of playing the game, they envisage, imagine, and play with all sorts of different responses, all sorts of different ways of preparing themselves and their communities for the kind of disasters that might come. And after playing the game, they then have less inertia and more energy for taking specific and identified actions. So TAG's not about trying to convert people who don't believe in climate change. It's about mobilizing the people that already understand that climate change is real, but feel that lack of agency. And it's really working at that very personal community level, helping people imagine and build the world that we need. So to give you more of a sense of how the game operates, I'm going to hand over to Hayley to walk you through it.
So TAG is a game, but more importantly, TAG is a workshop and TAG is a program. It's something that we do with you especially we're working a lot with local government. So that's, a lot of who we're talking to today and who we've been working with as a tool that you can bring to community. So you've probably encountered games. You might be thinking video game. You might be thinking Monopoly. So TAG is closer to that tabletop side of the spectrum. So you can see in the pictures on the left of this slide that there are sort of 5 people sitting around a table, and one of those people is a facilitator. So they actually guide the other 4 people through the story. And that's really important because it's a game, but it's more like a flexible tool for engaging people in a story, in a conversation, engaging them with knowledge, but also in knowledge sharing across the table between them. And so the facilitator is there to make the journey custom to those people. Often the game is played as part of a larger workshop. Sometimes we'll do some climate change context setting, saying, there's all of these possible things that could still happen in our future, and that, we're sort of going to use this time machine gizmo to go to an alternate possible reality, starting from today and moving through a possible future, one that's going to be tough, but one where we think we're going to make it through. And that does a few things. It gives people a sense that there are many possible futures, but also says, this is the macro level of things that we can talk about, but actually we're coming down to the micro level within that macro scenario. Because I think one of the key differences between TAG and other games that talk about climate change is people play as themselves, and they play in their community where they live. And that's really crucial to that diagram that Carrie showed earlier about moving from fear and anxiety and paralysis because I'm being asked to march and vote, or take shorter showers, but that doesn't actually connect back to me and my survival and my day-to-day worries and protecting my family. So we're creating this context for people to connect to that through the game. Here's what the game looks like, kind of all laid out on the table as the players would see it. It does come in a box. In fact, here, I'll hold that up. Like any board game. But in this layout, you can see that the facilitator might be sitting up here at the top, and then each of the 4 players has their own set of components that they use to engage in the story. And in the middle, there's a map of a local council area. In this case, this is the basic map that we made with Maribyrnong City Council, so just on the west side of the city of Melbourne. There's also information that the players don't see right away, but that the facilitator does have and see, and that's introduced through the game. So the big dramatic events that happen in the game are what we call shocks. These are scenarios of climate impacts. So in Maribyrnong, the shocks are a heat shock, so a heat wave, a flood shock, so some flooding, and then a combination of the two where we have heat wave, and then we have a storm that creates the flooding from rain, but not so much the flooding from the river. And included in those scenarios are also these trouble cards, which are more like how does the trouble come home for each individual player? And we'll talk more about those. So each local council that we work with to create their version of the game gets their own set of maps and shocks. So we work with you to figure out what are the relevant shocks. So in Marybeck, it's a heat wave and a flood. In City of Bendigo, bushfire comes to the fore. And, in City of Port Phillip, it's the storm surge. The game has a facilitator's guide, so it has a rule book, but which is mainly for the facilitator. So players don't need to learn a lot of rules because the facilitator walks them through it. But the powerful thing about tag is you don't need us to come and be facilitators. So we train you and your community members to become facilitators of the game so that you have a stable capability to keep playing the game into your community after we've set you up. So when the game starts, the facilitator has brought them into the table and each one creates their character. Now, as I said, you play yourself, but what games can do is provide a bit of a veil of safety to allow people to explore challenging topics by playing as a fictional version of themselves. They might change their age or their name or make up some pets that they don't have. And they also select from a deck of 12 cards to represent what are the things they're putting their energy into. Because the big thing about tag is how are you spending your available energy? You have all these things in life that you need to do, but you also now need to make adaptations to prepare for climate change. So how are you balancing those things? As part of this, they also place themselves on the map. So each player has the color assigned to them. We're seeing the blue player here. So the blue player's house is positioned here on the map, and their favorite spot, that might be a park where they walk their dog, is here, and all 4 of the players have done that. And also as part of that, they've introduced themselves to each other, and we're starting to form a bit of a community so that we can, even if the players don't know each other, maybe they've just showed up to an event, they can start to think about how they collaborate to adapt and respond. So we talked about shocks and things that people need to prepare for, but in a game, you also have powers, you have abilities, and the main power or ability that you have in this game is the power of adaptation. So that's making small, tangible changes in your life that can help you respond to climate change. So those may be very individual preparation-oriented things, like having enough food and medicine supplies for 2 weeks in the case of an emergency. It may be something like getting a solar panels or battery on your house, or it might be a bit more social, joining a community garden. Wellness is a big part of this. We get players brainstorming some ideas, but we give them this adaptation guide to ask them questions to help them think. What we don't do, this is really important in the design, is give them a to-do list, because we feel that actually takes away people's agency. We're trying to create agency and make sure this experience is relevant to them. So we ask them, what would you do in a blackout? How well do you bounce back from stress? Just to get them thinking about possible adaptations they could do. Now, if they've already made adaptations, if they already have solar panels, they have those in the game, they don't need to make a card or spend energy on them. So once we've done that, the setup's over and we start going into the rounds, and the game unfolds in up to 4 rounds. We can play just 1 round, we can play 2 rounds. It's flexible. And each round actually starts with a piece of news. And so this is where we want to bring in that sense of, oh, there's this global news, there's these challenging things happening, I can't do anything about it. We want to sort of invoke that in the game space while then moving on pretty quickly into what they can do locally. And there's also a concept of community resilience. So not just your individual resilience, but your resilience as a whole community. And the first thing that happens is the news is bad. And so our community resilience goes down, and that can have some impacts later in the game. So after we hear the news, we get players to share their current state of mind, and we're actually getting them, maybe they're talking about how badly the news felt, or maybe they're talking about that adaptation they're excited to do. So you can see this player, I feel sad about the Great Barrier Reef, but I'm also nervous because my oldest child is now starting high school. And, you know, we're entering into the future through this game. So it's, we're 2 years in the future now. So my kids are actually a little older. And maybe they can help out with some of my adaptations. We also have the concept of well-being, because we found, and this has really played out, that it's so important that people not only have the energy or the money to do adapt, but how do they feel, and how does that affect their ability and affect their energy? So we have this little token on their character sheet where they can say, are they thriving? Are they healthy? Are they stressed? Or are they struggling? And that's primarily up to them to sort of set that throughout the game. So then each round, they take those adaptation ideas that they had earlier and decide which ones to do. And in order to be able to do adaptations, they need to spend these energy cards. Where do they get those energy cards? Well, it depends on how their well-being is doing. So if they've rated their well-being as healthy, they get to draw 3. If they're stressed, they only draw 2. And then for each of those adaptations, they rate how many energy, 1 to 3, does it cost to start them, and how many energy does it cost to keep them going. So solar panels are expensive to start, maybe it's 3, but maybe it's 0 to keep them going. And this is actually a really interesting part of the game, because that conversation about what's a good adaptation, how much do they cost, is something that where knowledge is really powerfully shared across the table from people who have maybe done that before. And I'm not looking at the chat, Carrie, so let me know if someone has a timely question. So we do really want to emphasize that the government is not there to bail everybody out. People need to be prepared. They need to be resilient in the communities on their own. And yet our local councils that we work with do have programs that they want people to know about, that they are planning. So we work with them to figure out what are 8 or 10 climate resilience focused programs that are in planning. And we literally put those into the game on a track, from just ideas to pre-launch to being launched or completed, that they're out there in the world. And the community resilience track that we saw earlier, depending on where that is, they can only advance 2 programs or 3 programs each round. So they're having to choose the same way they had to choose their adaptations. And that, in a sense, ends the first adaptation phase, where we've prepared as individuals, as neighbors and community, and also as a local council through the medium of government. That's when the shock comes. So as the facilitator, I would say, okay, today's shock is a heat wave. And I would read out this scenario. We've entered our 5th day of an extreme heat wave of days above 35 degrees C. And this is all stuff we've worked with the council to get correct for this area. And then I slide out the base map from below the tokens, because there's a piece of glass there. And underneath it is, boom, there's this heat wave map. And suddenly people go, oh, I live in the heat wave zone, or I live in the flood zone. And we have a discussion about how did our programs, or how did our adaptations that we banded together to do, how might they have helped the community in this? It says on this card that the community resilience is going to go down too, but we work together to figure out maybe our programs actually prevented some of that, and it's going to keep us resilient. And that really gives people an immersive experience of kind of, right, I'm in it now, what's happening, and how can things that I actually did or that I'm already doing help? That's at the sort of community scale. But what about as individuals? They've done their individual adaptations. Those aren't going to help the whole community. How can it help? How does that affect them? So we create those 15 trouble cards that we mentioned earlier for each of the shocks. and each player is given 3, and they're given the chance to choose the one that best fits their story. And that's a really interesting moment because people often actually pick one that's hard, that's a challenge for them, and we find they really want to lean in to the storytelling of struggling through. So this player is saying, okay, I've chosen the card about the party. You are throwing a party and you spend all morning setting up decorations in the sun. And by the time everyone arrives, you start feeling ill and are rushed to the hospital. You might have some kidney damage and must rest for 2 weeks. They're saying, that sounds like me. I'm struggling to have to accept help from other people, but I joined that neighbors mutual aid group that we started. That's actually, those people are actually coming over and helping me. So I might have gone all the way down to struggling, but instead I'm going to say I'm just stressed because I'm being cared for. So it's that moment of resolving and imagining themselves in that scenario and imagining themselves being helped and getting reward from the adaptations they made. So then we close the shock and return things to normal reality. We bring that base map back in, and the heat wave goes away. And this gives us another opportunity to reflect and say, what was that year like? And we do one more reflection around the table. What was that year like for me? But also to say, what about those adaptations that didn't help us during the heat wave, but maybe helped us with our well-being? That community garden didn't really feed me during the heat wave, but I made friends there. And throughout the year, when things are stressful, I'm now participating. And often people go, yeah, I was stressed because of the heat wave, but now I'm feeling a little bit better. And that's an important balance between those things to give people that sense of agency. We often say we have 2 dials, one is fear and one is hope, and we're trying to get them just right when we make the game so that people leave with the appropriate urgency, but also agency to do things. And that's what this last slide for me is about, is tag is meant to be a bridge to action. And so we can do this differently depending on how you want to do it to engage with your community. But we try and find ways to connect people to action. In Port Phillip, we had 4 SES players in uniform come and play and sit at each of the tables. So they were ready to talk to people about volunteering or just prep things that they can do. And they had materials on hand. We also make these flyers shaped like the adaptation cards that have links on QR codes to different resources or action opportunities that they might have. And they can write down the one thing that they took away from the game that they want to do and stick this on their fridge when they get home. So that's a very creative space for us. So that's it for the game walkthrough.